Morning, everybody. Great to see so many people here. Hope you're all keeping safe and well. I'm John Cotton. I'm a councillor in Birmingham and the chair of Labour Housing Group. So really pleased to welcome you all here this morning. Just as a small matter of housekeeping, if you could keep your microphones on mute, so that saves any feedback coming through while our speakers are talking, and then obviously we'll bring people in when we reach questions. So if you just keep microphones muted, except for the person who's speaking. As you know, Labour Housing Group has a long and very proud history of leading policy debates within the Labour Party around housing. And I think today's theme around developing a private rented sector that's fit for purpose is a very clear example of how we're trying to focus on the major priorities and challenges facing the country and the Labour Party in these difficult times. And it's also an area where Labour's done a lot of policy thinking over the last few years. And I hope you've had a chance to look at the note that was circulated in advance that set out some of the policies that the party has been pursuing in this area. And also, if you haven't had a chance yet, please do have a look on the Red Brick blog, where there were 3 very good articles this week setting out some of the issues around private rented sector challenges and issues. So what we want to try and use today for is to look forward and assess what else we need to do, what are the new answers and the new policies that we need in 2020 in this rather strange post-COVID world that we find ourselves in. We've got some really good speakers lined up to speak to you this morning, and I hope they'll inspire some thoughts and some really good questions and debates as we move into the workshops later on as well. Can I ask that as the speakers are delivering the presentations, if questions occur, can you put those in the chat facility, and I will pick those up and then bring questioners in at the appropriate moment. I'll look to bring in as many as I can. So what would be helpful is if you could just limit to putting questions in the chat rather than general comments, so I can pick those up fairly quickly. Finally, just to let everybody know that we are recording today's session, and that the plan is to put that up on the Labour Housing Group website after today's event, so people can have a look at some of the debates and discussions. The only bit that won't be on there is the breakout groups later on, but all of the main plenary session, if you like, will be recorded and put online. So without any further ado, I'd like to move us on to our first panel. Our first speaker should be no stranger to any of you. It's Thangam Debbonaire MP, MP for Bristol West, and our new Shadow Secretary of State for Housing. I think it's fair to say Thang's really hit the ground running in terms of taking the debate forward and certainly working with Labour Housing Group. So Thangam's going to touch on the Labour's campaign around COVID-19, the response in terms of the private rented sector, and some of the immediate issues that are emerging. So over to you, Thangam, and welcome.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Sheila, and everyone and Labour Housing Group for organising this event. I know these are really strange times, and the fact that we're not meeting in reality, I miss it a lot, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in real life, but I'm not sorry that we're able to do this, that we don't have to just not do anything and not speak to each other. It's great that we're able to do this, and thank you for organising it, and to everyone for sticking with the tech, which I know can sometimes be a bit bumpy. I won't be able to see your faces because I'm looking at my speech, which is on the screen, and I'm hoping that I can then come back to questions afterwards. I think that's what we're doing, isn't it? So I would first of all like to thank my absolutely inspiring and supportive predecessor, John Healy, and his team, who did such a brilliant job in this brief. There were 4 of them, there's 2 of us, but we've got a firm set of foundations on which we can build, and there may be more building puns this morning. Mike Amesbury is my brilliant Shadow Housing Minister, and the rest of the MHCLG team, Steve Reed, Kate Holland, Nas Shah, Janet Davey, plus our Parliamentary Private Secretary Ferial Clark, but also really importantly, some of you may have come across our brilliant whip James Murray, who was a Deputy Mayor for Housing in London. So the support and the ideas and guidance that I've had from Labour Housing Group in particular, but also Labour councillors, some of whom I can see on this call, and Labour campaigning groups, and the wider homelessness and housing sector has just been absolutely brilliant, and I'm grateful to you all. As you know, as an opposition, we don't get a civil service. We don't have what the government has. In order to fight like with like, we rely on you, and I'm terribly grateful for what you do to keep me up to speed. So we all know that the Tories are presiding over a broken housing system. They know it, we know it, and more importantly, the voters know it, including those who didn't vote for us in 2019. But where we, as Labour, we see a raw need and gaping holes that we long to fix, Tories see an opportunity for financial exploitation. We all know everyone should have a decent home that's truly affordable, not pretend affordable, with a secure tenure, built by materials and to a spec that help meet our net zero carbon emissions targets urgently. They should be powered by renewable energy, they should be well insulated, well connected to public transport, good jobs and community facilities, and access to green and open space. And we know that that would create great jobs and apprenticeships. We know that research commissioned by Crisis and National Housing Federation identified that the country needs to build 345,000 new homes each year over 15 years across all three sectors of owner-occupied, social ownership and private rent to deal with the backlog of 4.75 million households in some form of housing need. And even on the very slight improvement of a really low spot in 2012-2013, the current government would need to increase supply by 43% to reach that level. But COVID has exposed the consequences when people don't have decent housing, and that's particularly, but not only, in the private rented sector. So lack of access to outdoor and green space has had severe consequences for people's mental and physical health. High rents in insecure housing with poor living conditions put millions of people in the private rented sector in debt just when their income fell, exacerbated by health problems that made it harder and impossible to isolate or practice social distancing. There's been increased risk for Black, Asian and other minority ethnic people. These are compounded by poor quality and overcrowded housing. We're seeing that now in the spikes in infection. Decent, affordable net zero carbon homes should not be too much to ask for everyone in this country at any time. But COVID has shown up starkly what happens when they're treated as optional by a government. As we in my team have been exposing, and the media has actually been covering pretty well, the actual Secretary of State for Housing, Robert Jenrick, has basically been rooking Londoners in favour of Richard Desmond, to the tune of possibly £50 million less in community infrastructure levy, genuinely affordable housing, and just generally behaving in a thoroughly reprehensible way. We've also been exposing the huge gaps in the government support for people in the private rented sector. We've liaised with stakeholders who've got this knowledge that I've talked about, and about the impact of COVID on private renters in particular, and solutions. So we all know that a broken housing system can be fixed with political will. We know that even the problems we've got at the moment can be ameliorated with political will. We know that political will is one of the things we have in common with each other, and that the electorate wants from their leaders. Housing is one of the routes to Labour winning the next general election. We understand what people are experiencing when they're struggling in the unaffordable private rented sector, and we know how to work with them to fix it. So as we come through what I've come to think of as the portal of COVID and survey the economic, social, health and cultural landscape that lies beyond, any decent government should be asking, how can we make sure we've learnt the lessons? How can we build the homes people really need so that the suffering they've endured is not repeated? How can we do this in ways which create good, well-paid jobs with a future, and thus helping to rebuild public confidence and the economy, as well as good homes? Unfortunately, the Tories seem to be saying, how can we help our friends to extract the maximum economic advantage out of other people's suffering? So what we've got is a push on councils to relax planning conditions, making it easier for those big developers like Desmond to do less, making it harder for those developers who do actually want to do more to make it economically viable. There's no acknowledgement that we've been exposing this, that their financial support schemes, whilst welcome, have left millions of people without help, particularly people with no recourse to public funds, but others as well, as various select committees have highlighted, which has left many people struggling with rent and bills, and some people destitute. And the PM's speech last week showed a government intent on pushing more publicly owned land into the hands of deregulated private developers and bypassing the planning system. This is a government that's put the responsibility for housing street homeless people onto local authorities without enough cash, and shortly will blame them when they're not able to continue accommodating them without making cuts elsewhere. And it's the Secretary of State who cozies up to these developers at Tory fundraisers to overturn planning decisions days later. So ahead of us, the people in the private rented sector, but also in the social rented and owner occupied, we have the potential impact of social catastrophe of Tories mismanaging the country, like they've done for 10 years, but on steroids, with Tory values, not Labour values. The housing consequences could be devastating, and we're going to need to be ready. First, on homelessness. This week, I met, as I regularly do, with different groups of people, Labour councillor, housing leads, stakeholders from across the country. And this week was to discuss the end of the Everybody In and the lifting of the evictions ban, which both look set to create a homelessness crisis in early autumn. The Tories promised a renters' rights bill and to scrap Section 21 evictions. We want them to do this, but it's nowhere to be seen. We want them to remove Section 8 eviction proceedings, at least for the life of the crisis, so that people who've got into arrears are not faced with mandatory eviction. But primarily, we want to prevent the problem. We want the government to help make sure people don't get into rent arrears by giving them enough money. And we've suggested ways of improving universal credit. Actually, I think the best way of improving universal credit is scrap it. But even in this crisis, they could ameliorate it so that people were able to pay rent and their living expenses. These are ideas supported by Shelter, Citizens Advice, Generation Rent, because I'm old-fashioned and I think the cure for being short of income is to make sure there is enough. And as Labour, we work together to address the precarious position of tenants who don't have market choice, who are in insecure, overcrowded, substandard accommodation. They are our top priority. Making sure they have enough money to pay rent has to be an urgent priority. Sorting out the housing system has got to be ours when we get into government, but we know the Tories aren't going to do that. Now, it's unfortunate that the way Labour policy has been misrepresented by some. It's unfortunate because our policies would have been a better way of protecting people from evictions, contrasting with the policy actually on mortgage holidays, which is a misleading term, holiday, because actually the mortgage holiday policy that the government has introduced actually does still put the money on the end. And their credit rating is negatively effective, whereas our policy on renters would have put renters in a much better position of actually being able to pay rent and not rack up arrears. It's unfortunate that there's been this misrepresentation, because unfortunately this means the government can and is denigrating us as the ones who are trying to abolish rent. Now, that isn't our policy. It never was under the current leadership or Jeremy Corbyn. I can't really understand why anyone who wants to help renters or supports Labour would be telling renters that it's Labour who are the problem. The Tories are in government. They're the ones putting people into debt. We would be doing it differently. We'd be making sure that those schemes properly covered living costs as well as creating the backstop protection. So in the last 2 months, Labour has announced we want the government to scrap the benefit cap, the 2-child limit, the savings cap. We want the government to raise the local housing allowance to cover average rents, at least for the life of the crisis. It's the Tories who are refusing. It's never been our view that people who rent a penthouse in Park Lane should be excused paying rent because of the crisis. It's our policy to push ideas that would help our people struggling, people who've been pushed into hardship, not just by this crisis, but also by the unaffordable housing that the Tories failed to fix after 10 years of actually making the problem worse. We know that cross-party select committees have identified who's falling between the gaps, in the gaps, and we know that Citizens Advice, Shelter and Generation Rent are calling for the same things as we're calling for, which is improve the benefits and reform the laws on eviction as a backstop. We've warned the Tories of the impending disaster, but the government has now announced that evictions can start up again at the end of August, and they're saying that our policy is to encourage people not to pay rent. Now, what they're doing here is really important to notice. It means that they can fail to address the gaps in income, which they've caused, and blame us if and when tenants start getting evicted due to rent arrears. And I'm afraid to say that's what they're going to do. Meanwhile, advice agencies tell us of a lack of sufficient advisors to help people. So a Labour renters' rights bill could cover all of this and much more. But we don't have a Labour government, and we don't even have the Tory version of the renters' rights bill. And renters are struggling because of Tories. I want to mention safety briefly, because that also applies to obviously across all sectors. In the private rented sector, we know that many people are still in houses that are homes that are potential Grenfells, in tall buildings with the same cladding as at Grenfell, others with more dangerous cladding, others that are overcrowded or poorly kept up by unscrupulous landlords who are failing to take their responsibilities seriously. We also know that some of the people in those Grenfell-style buildings are having to pay waking watch fees of up to £700 a month on top of rent or mortgage for a security guard type system to be on the lookout for fire. This is a problem that they never made and never gave any consent to, and it's a disgrace that they're being held responsible. On planning and house building, if we really wanted to reform the private rented sector, we would be making sure there was more social housing, more council housing, and that housing in all sectors was truly affordable. Any decent government would be carrying out counter-cyclical investment for decent homes across all the sectors to fix the broken housing system. Every new economic investment should be demonstrating how it helps us to reach net zero carbon emissions. But the announcement we had this week from Johnson predictably painted planning as the blocker of house building, which is obviously rubbish. And there are problems with planning, but that's not the issue. There are hundreds of thousands of planning permissions over the country, across the country, which have not been built out. What they've done instead is use that as an excuse to push on permitted developments, creating more rabbit hutches and calling them homes and bypassing local democracy. So I'm judging the government and I'm finding them wanting, because what they announced does not contribute to achieving net zero carbon targets through retrofitting, insulation, renewable energy, building regs, all of which could be in a renters' rights bill. All of that could be in there. Does it increase a total stock of a truly affordable, high quality, safe, secure housing to people in the places we need them across owner occupied, council, social and private rented sector? It does not. Is there sound financial support? There was no new money for housing. Does it create good, well-paying jobs? There was no mention of how the government plans to retrain people who've lost their jobs. There's a mention of young people, but it doesn't really there's no plan behind it. They've undermined local councillors and mayors. They've bypassed local democracy almost completely. Money that there is going to metro mayors and local economic partnerships. And it's a toss-up whether or not local councillors who really know their own patch will get any say at all. And it doesn't reform the private rented sector with strong regulation for safety, for quality, for tenure and affordability. We know the government's record is woeful on all of these dimensions, and we know that this government does favours for their mates. That's what we're up against, and that's what we're scrutinising them on, and that's how we're exposing them. We've actually been doing pretty well out of the coverage in the media over the last few weeks, and I've been really pleased with how that's going. And even, people just are coming up to me when I'm out and about and saying, keep going on Generic. The man's obviously a crook. So finally, we on this call in the Labour Party, we're a fantastic movement of amazing people, and we've all got our ideas about why we've lost 4 elections in a row, and we've all got our ideas about how we win the next one. Now, if you've read the recently published Labour Together report, or you've done other investigations, you'll know what a big job we've got to do. And the Labour Together report pulled together polling and other data to provide some of that evidence. So if we want to build a coalition of voters across all demographics, regions and nations, coast, rural, town and city, industrial and urban, former Labour heartlands and new seats, if we want to win back, win more, and hang on to the seats we've got, we need to create a story about the country we want to build, which speaks to the lives of most people and gives them hope for the future and a belief that we can build it, that Labour can do this. In the meantime, we have to point out where the Tories are failing them, and that is the primary duty of an opposition at this point in the electoral cycle. And you will see, and we can discuss this some more, I and my colleagues in the Shadow Cabinet, we're not going to be announcing bucket loads of policies at this point, because we don't know how much of a mess the Tories are going to have left the country in the 3 years that we've got to go before we have to start compiling the manifesto. But I do know that in broad themes, housing will be a big part of this, because housing is critical. It is everything. It could be the other side of the COVID portal, which provides the blueprint for a better way of living across the country. And reforming the private rented sector in this is absolutely critical. We want to build social housing. We want to build council housing. We want Labour councillors able to build the homes that they want in the social rented sector. But we know that there will always also be a need for the private rented sector. And I want that regulated. I want it well run. I want it to be truly affordable, proper tenure, and of high quality. Now, we know all this, which means that on housing, Labour wins. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Thangam. That was a really good tour of the horizon there and a scene setter for today's discussions. What I'm going to do is take questions when we've heard from our second speaker, who is Tom Renhard, who's the chair of ACORN, the Union for the Community, with a very strong record of championing tenants' rights and calling out injustices in the private rented sector. And Tom's going to talk to us about the experience of private renters since the pandemic began and lockdown began in March. So really, really good to welcome you here, Tom, and I'll pass over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Van Millong. I've got some slides as well that I'm going to whiz through, and obviously, you know, they're fine to also be circulated after today for those that would like to have them. So a bit about me and a bit about ACORN to start with, whilst the slides are popping up. I guess, Sheila, I'll let you know when I want to move on to the next slide. Sounds like the most useful way to do it. So as John mentioned, I'm Tom. I'm the chair of the board of directors of ACORN. ACORN is a community union that has been going for 6 years now, and we have over 3,000 members. We are in cities across the country, and I'm going to sort of just show you a bit of a list of where we're currently operating at the moment. And in that time, we've grown and grown and focused on a sort of a wide range of issues. But at the core of those issues has always been housing, has always been renting and people's experiences of kind of private renting. And for kind of how ACORN got going, it was about going door to door, knocking on people's doors, talking to people about what are the issues facing you in your community, what do you like about living in your community, and really starting to do that kind of grassroots work to understand what people's experiences were on the ground, and then build around issues of commonality. And you know, it would be no surprise to any of you here, I'm sure, that the first campaign way back in May, June 2014, when the team were sort of door knocking in Easton, was housing, was quality of the housing, the kind of conditions that people were renting in, speaking out about those conditions, and then the issues that would come from that when they were getting evicted, because actually the landlord would rather just kick out the tenant, get someone else in, and pay the bill for the repairs, which obviously have increased in cost because it's been left to sort of drag on and on and on and on. So if I can just go to the next slide. So obviously COVID-19 sort of coming on in March has, well, created challenges, would be putting it somewhat mildly. And it has changed the way ACORN has kind of had to think and operate as an organisation, because we couldn't really go door to door anymore, talking to people, as was our kind of bread and butter approach. So we had to think a bit more creatively, and in March, reorientate the organisation over one weekend to completely refocus on supporting people affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, in a bit of a similar way to what some of the mutual aid groups have been doing across the country as well. And what that has meant is we've then been out supporting people, sort of delivering leaflets to let people know that they can access support and help if they need it and haven't got access to things like computers and internet. And we've been out helping through sort of gathering medication, for example, through gathering food and essential supplies and taking them to the door for people. And also we have still been doing some campaigning, and of course doing our best to do that in an appropriate socially distanced manner, as you can hopefully see from the photo here, which is from our one of our campaigns that we were doing down at the Bristol Harbour side, related to our Housing is Health campaign, which I'll be coming on to in a little while. So if I can just move on to the next slide. It's just a couple of the things to pick up from in terms of like who we are. You know, really what's at the core of ACORN is about building collective power. You know, the idea is individuals, when we're trying to fight against organised money and people that are organised in other ways, and, you know, it's hard to be sort of the little person on your own fighting this big machine. So how can we build power? How can we map power? How can we identify who our allies are, who aren't our allies? How can we get the people that might be in the middle and build a coalition that can really help us to campaign on the key issues? And so that's really at the heart of what we do, and using an approach through direct action as well to help that, which has really helped us achieve some major successes, including against several banks, getting things like buy-to-let mortgage clauses removed, which were saying you had to charge maximum rents, stuff around no DSS, which was in one bank's clauses. I think it was TSB from memory off the top of my head. I was down at that one sort of in Bristol. And, you know, it was through those things, by kind of seizing power, and kind of the old kind of adage that, you know, power concedes nothing without a demand. And that's really where we're thinking and approaching the way we go forwards. I think the other thing to mention, for those of you that don't know, I'm sure many of you are aware, is ACORN is part of an international organisation, so we affiliate to it. The origins of ACORN actually date back to the USA in 1970. So ACORN has just turned 50 internationally, which is really exciting, and operates in many countries around the world, including Canada, including India as well, also in parts of Africa and South America as well, and also in parts of Europe. So we really are across the world trying to build power, not just in this country, but elsewhere too. So if I could just move on to my next slide. So this is just a collection of the places we're currently organising in. The ones you see on the very left column are the ones where we have established branches. So in order to become a district branch, they must have 100 members in that area, and then they've got a committee in place, and they're able to kind of formally represent in the national structures as well as the work they're doing locally. So at the moment, those are sort of Birmingham, Brighton, Bristol, Lancaster and Morecambe very recently, Leeds, Manchester, Newcastle and Sheffield. And then some of the groups we're working with to establish, again, across the country include Cambridge, Cardiff, Ceredigion, Coventry, Exeter down in the southwest, Hastings, Liverpool, Norwich, Nottingham, Portsmouth, Stoke and Newcastle under Lyme and Swindon. And so we're really working to build across the country. Many of them, yes, are urban settings, but we're also thinking about how can we organise in less urban settings as well, because we need to be everywhere. So if I can move on to the next slide. So one of the really key things for us has been around trying to protect renters through this COVID-19 pandemic. Many people have been hit really hard, particularly those that are on low incomes, that are potentially already out of work, that are from communities that are already disproportionately impacted anyway, such as the BAME community, in terms of sort of how COVID-19 has impacted them around health, among other things. And so we've really been focusing on how can we protect people, how can we raise awareness of those issues and really push for extra protections for people during this crisis. And if I could just move on to the next slide. I think one of the other things I just wanted to pick up on from here is you can find more information about our coronavirus work as well. So do check out some of these links that are dotted out throughout the presentation. In Bristol alone, we've worked to help, we've received over 1,000 requests for help through our kind of coronavirus response. And we've had hundreds of volunteers up and down the country. In Sheffield as well, we've had a huge operation. And again, if you go through to the website, you can see the links if we're still running that support. So if people want to make contact where we have a local group that are doing this stuff, then they can do so. So I'm going to kind of move on at pace and talk a bit more about sort of private rented. So if we can move on to the next slide, got another picture for you. So our focus has been what has been called our Housing is Health campaign. And for us, there have been a number of key demands that we've had around this. Many of these very much aligned to Labour's current policy, it has to be said as well, which is really, really useful in terms of sort of seeing where we are aligned and, extending the evictions ban for as long as is needed. And obviously there was an initial extension through to August, although, we are hugely concerned about the cliff edge that there is going to be come August as things like the furlough scheme wind down as well. There might be a resurgence of COVID-19 as well. There's going to be a lot of things that are going to coalesce into almost a perfect storm potentially. And, if we're starting to get towards Christmas and the potential flu season as well, there's a lot that could happen and a lot that could still go wrong for people. So we really want to be pushing for further extensions of the evictions ban. Obviously, it's been policy, I think, of Labour for a long time, and as it has with ACORN, we want to see an immediate and permanent end to Section 21. We responded to the consultation last year. We met with the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government as well. One of the other things as well is where evictions processes had started, we wanted to see those pause and we wanted to see those having to be restarted once the kind of the ban on evictions was lifted, rather than just carrying on where it was and giving people a bit more time to be able to kind of support themselves. Obviously, we are thinking about kind of those that have mortgages and stuff as well. It's not just renters that are affected by these issues, and sort of a government legislated mortgage and interest payment freeze was something that was really important to us and our members, and also thinking about protections against evictions for lodgers as well, and the very unique set of circumstances that there are. that can potentially have implications as well for, you know, do people still want to then rent to lodgers if you kind of strengthen the protection? So we do have to be mindful of some of the unintended consequences sometimes when we're thinking about how we develop housing policy. So if I can move on to the next slide, which is just kind of in a bit more detail, the kind of the 6 kind of key ones for us. And the one I do just want to touch on, and I think it is where ACORN's position does differ from Labour's current approach, is around suspension of rent. And I think for us, there are, as I was talking about with the furlough scheme coming to an end, and the financial position and the precariousness of people's situations at the moment, I think there's a real issue around the rent debt that could be building up for people. And you know, our position is and remains that for that rent debt that is accrued during the crisis, we want to see that effectively waived. And yes, we know there are implications for that depending on the sector you're thinking about. If you're thinking about council housing, for example, and therefore the impact on local authorities and their funds, or housing associations, and those things do need to be thought through, and it does need to be funded. But I guess it's about us kind of being bold as well. You know, if we kind of went back to March and the start of the pandemic as well, would we have seriously said we would have managed to get the government to fund 80% of people's wages? So we need to recognise as well that what might be realistic is it's a different conversation now to where we were pre-COVID-19. So that's one thing that we're really pushing for. So if I can go on to the next couple of slides, and the next one after that. Brilliant. So some of the other things we've been doing specifically to support renters, there have been people still being, landlords still trying to evict renters even during the pandemic. And one of the things we've done is we've developed a template letter as well for people that want a rent reduction and want kind of a way to kind of, how do I even go about having that conversation with my landlord? Because many renters have been able to negotiate rent reductions either to nothing or to the cost of the interest payments that may have been added on to the end of the landlord's mortgage. So many people are winning those reductions. We've also been encouraging people to still campaign on issues around getting deposits back where there have been problems. I think I've just recently finished renting in a property and I'm still waiting on my deposit, for example. And of course, we've had the MHCLG Select Committee consultation during this time. So one of the things we did was organise the campaign to encourage responses to that consultation. And I think we were quite surprised to hear that, like, you know, 200-300 responses was quite a lot for a consultation, and sort of us helping to kind of get those things heard. We've of course lobbying with MPs. We've obviously met with Thangam, which was a really helpful discussion to have and kind of unpick some of these issues. And we've also published an open letter to government, and again you can click through to that link sort of with these slides. If I can move on to the next slide. So obviously one of the big news this week is the response to the Select Committee report has been released from the government. Didn't really kind of say anything useful, in my opinion, to be honest. It was, well, we're not going to do anything until after COVID, I think was about the gist. And it was like, well, that's not really very helpful, because when's that going to end? You know, we could be kind of in a cycle of COVID-19 for, what, a couple of years, potentially, if some of the reports that are being made. Therefore, delaying looking at the abolition of Section 21 until post-coronavirus is one of the things they've said. And on the sort of the part of the Select Committee report around potential discretionary powers for judges in Section 21, Section 28 hearings, again, it was very vague, very non-committal. And there were some interesting ideas around sort of those potential discretionary powers, I think. And obviously, particularly for those of you that kind of know kind of sort of how kind of like case law can generate in terms of, well, if something then ends up in the Court of Appeal or potentially the Supreme Court, and it is potential to set further precedents. And of course, there is no proposed extension to the eviction ban. So there is a real risk that there will be a wave of eviction notices served on the 24th of August, I think it is, which is, you know, of real concern. And, you know, we'll be ready. We've been training up kind of members across the country through training sessions in recent weeks to ensure that they're ready to help protect people from being evicted legally or illegally, and really upskilling our members to be the sort of that community fabric and to stand shoulder to shoulder with their sort of fellow community members in fighting for kind of like the little person in all this against this sort of big machine that only benefits those big sort of housing owners. So if we can move on to the next slide, just kind of consciously need to wrap up. So some of the kind of key things for us, these are just a selection that focus more on kind of private renting. I must say these aren't the only things that I think need to happen around the housing sector. You know, we obviously need to get more affordable housing built, like genuinely affordable, more council housing built as well. Obviously, you know, Section 21 and getting rid of that is really one of the key things for us, as well as the rest of our housing is health key demands. You know, I think one of the things that still remains at the forefront of us is about raving rent debt. We're going to be facing potentially the worst recession in 300 years. And, you know, I think none of us are, certainly in this group, underestimating the potential catastrophe that could bring for working people and working families across the country. And I think if I sort of go to my next slide, I think that's my lots. So one last thing, join ACORN as well, encourage people to get involved. You know, we can achieve more, sort of the stronger and bigger that we are. And I've also left my details on the final slide in case you wish to get in touch with me in the future. So thanks very much for listening.
Just fiddling with the tech there, missing the mute button. Thank you very much for that, Tom. That was really good and thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure we'll all be following some of those links that you've put up following today's event. I'm now going to open it up for some questions to Tom and to Thangam. I've got a question that's come up in the chat from Carla. Now, shall we experiment and see if we can unmute and perhaps bring Carla in to ask that question?
Hi.
Oh. We heard you briefly and then it stopped.
Hello?
I can hear you now, Carla. That's great.
Can you hear me now? Fantastic. Thank you very much for the presentations. They're really excellent. My question is around back land grabbing. In 2010, Greg Clark, the MP, he gave new powers, which was to stop and prevent back land grabbing. However, it still seems to be in existence, and what's happening is councils are extremely concerned about challenging some of the cases that are coming to the planning committee because of fear of fines. Now they're losing in around about 12 million between 2010 and 2016, and I'm just wondering what our policy can be to restore confidence back in the planning system, where councils feel that they can represent their communities where issues come up and they feel that they are genuinely needing to be objected and fairly dealt with.
Thanks, Carla. I'm going to try and take 2 or 3 questions and then ask the speakers to respond. So I'm going to ask John Gray if he'd like to come in and ask his question.
Yeah, thanks, John. In Newham, East London, we've had a problem with the police effectively facilitating illegal evictions, even during COVID. I've had to write to the police superintendent this week. Some of the police, some of them are very good, but some of them treat it as a civil dispute and they try to mediate. I've actually helped, as I said, with illegal evictions. So I'm just wondering, sort of nationally, can we put pressure on the police to understand that, you know, especially at this time, such evictions are illegal and they should be stopped by the frontline police, not helped.
Thanks, John. And I'll also take a question that Paul Smith has put up in the chat as well. Paul?
Thank you. Yeah, my issue is one relating to the privatisation of affordable housing by companies like Blackstone through their vehicle Sage, which is working with a large number of local authorities, including Labour authorities, I'm afraid to say, across the country. The UN rapporteur has actually raised the issue, and it was covered in a film called Push, whereby Blackstone internationally have taken over affordable housing, then lobbied government very successfully, and I'm sure they'd be successful with this government, to deregulate the sector so that they can then gentrify the housing and force out people on low incomes. And I've not yet seen anything from Labour, you know, even under the previous regime within the party, about what we're going to do about these private sector registered providers, and whether we're going to reverse that policy which allows private companies to become affordable housing providers.
Thanks, Paul. And I'll just take one more question, which is Tom Newmark.
Thank you very much, Chair. Sorry, there's light behind me. You'll have to imagine what my face looks like. No, thank you very much for the presentations. It's great to hear the reaffirmation of our support for council housing. I was just wondering because we know there are some Tory-controlled councils that won't build the units that are needed, and that probably also applies to enforcement on the private rented sector. Where's our thinking currently about what to do about that issue, about Tory-controlled councils maybe not using powers or not using money?
Thanks, Tom. And what I will do, I see that Liz Davis has just put a question in as well, so I'll take Liz's as the final one, then hand back to our speakers. Over to you, Liz.
John, thanks so much. Thangam and Tom, thank you very much. You've both referred to the madness that is likely to ensue when possession claims start again on the 24th of August, and we still have Section 21 no-fault evictions and Ground 8. The Tories went into the general election with a commitment to abolish Section 21. They said so in the Queen's speech, so that was in normal times. Even the Select Committee, which, as Tom said, is disappointing, has urged the abolition of Section 21 urgently. What are the chances of the Tory MPs putting pressure on their government actually to implement their general election commitment in time for there not to be this appalling gap between possession claims starting again on the 24th of August and landlords being able to use Section 21? Is there any chance either of the moratorium perhaps on Section 21 claims being extended or on Section 21 abolition being brought forward urgently?
Thanks, Liz, and thank you all for those questions. I'm going to ask our two speakers now to come back. Tom, would you like to come back first, and then I'll hand over to Thangam?
Yeah, sure. No, thank you for those really excellent questions. I think I'm going to try and quickly dart through, comment on each of them. Sort of starting with the one around planning. I mean, planning is not something I'm much of an expert in, but what I can talk to is kind of ACORN's experience of trying to engage with the planning system as part of a campaign around a development called the Chocolate Factory in Bristol, which had very little affordable housing proposed as part of it. And I think one of the things that really kind of ties communities' hands behind their backs is not just kind of the national framework, but also local policy planning as well, and the local plan that you have for your area, which is where you have some influence to kind of shape like additional policies and put additional things in place that can sort of make your decisions a bit more kind of robust from a legal perspective, and things less likely to then succeed at appeal. But again, I say it's not kind of my area of expertise, but I think sort of thinking about the local planning law and the local plan that you might have in your area and how you can kind of utilize that is something to kind of consider. I think so I'd really welcome pressure being put on the police if they're facilitating illegal evictions. That shouldn't be happening. I think the legislation was pretty clear. There's an evictions ban until towards the end of August. So I think that would be really important. I think it's one thing I'm going to be taking back to ACORN to ask kind of how much they've been coming across that as well. Obviously, one of the things we do is have sort of 20 people stood at the door with the person that they're trying to evict, and often that kind of is enough to kind of just make the bailiffs or whoever go away in of itself without kind of the need for further issue or incident. I fully agree with kind of Paul's comments and that needing to be addressed. And I guess for the last couple on here, I guess I'd sort of welcome to hear from others in terms of like how do we kind of address kind of building council housing when we're in opposition and where we're not kind of in charge in local areas. It's a really tricky issue, but it is something we need to think about how we leverage the power we do have and also build a collective voice so it's harder to ignore and that they need to be seen to be doing it. And I think, the thing I just want to spend a couple of minutes on is really kind of, thank you for your question. I think there is still a real opportunity to get that ban extended. And I still think it is possible to push for that ban to get extended. The closer we get to that date and the closer we get to the precipice, I think the more people that are going to be coming forward calling for that ban to be extended, because I think, whatever the situation is now, we're in the start of July. A lot is going to change in the next 6, 7, 8 weeks by the time we're there, particularly things like the furlough scheme and people being under a lot more pressure financially, potentially having lost their jobs and things. And so I think the climate will allow us to push for certainly an extension. I'd obviously like to see Section 21 permanently banned. And I guess one of the other challenges we have, though, is, many MPs in the Houses of Parliament are landlords themselves. So is it in their interest to want to do that? And that's something that we need to be mindful of and be actively calling out, I think, as well. And I am aware there are landlords across the parties, but, thinking about some of those that have sort of on the Tory side that have talked bills out of Parliament before when we've tried to get kind of protections for renters through, is something for us to really think about and really building that kind of collective action. As I said, we're training up our members to be able to support people. Given that there is going to be almost a tsunami of potential kind of like eviction notices served, I mean, I guess there's also a question about how quickly the courts are actually going to deal with them from a practical perspective. But that's not going to be nice for people's mental health and well-being. Like my day job is running an organisation that campaigns for like better mental health support from a user-led perspective. And when we all know that one of the things that really impacts poor mental health is less to do with kind of services and more to do with wider social determinants of mental health, like your housing situation, like your employment status, community connections. Are you stuck with a load of debt financially? And so the more that we can do to support people, a lot of people that are going to be coming in this situation, then the more realistic our prospects are of getting it either extended or bringing the sort of Section 21 ban forward, which they've promised to do, having done a consultation on it already. So they need to get on with it.
Thanks, Tom. Thangam, let's come back.
Thank you, and thank you, Tom and John and everyone for those questions. Carla, I fear, I'm afraid to say, the question about planning, my heart just sinks at the moment, because this government really showed this week. I thought it was completely shameless, actually. I don't know how you felt, because in the 2 weeks run up to the speech, we'd been given very strong hints that Boris Johnson was going to basically burn all the planning regs. And then the more our generic stories were just in wall-to-wall coverage in the media, we thought they can't possibly want to go ahead with this now. It would look so shameless. And then when they did anyway, I thought, there's my answer. Why are you so naive, Thangam? Of course, they are shameless. Absolutely shameless. Why would it surprise us that somebody who sits next to a property developer, a Tory fundraiser, in the general election, when he shouldn't have been doing those things anyway? I mean, fundraiser, yes, but proactively contacting his civil service from his parliamentary email, which anyone who's worked for an MP knows you're not supposed to do during a general election, texting him the next day, actively setting up the appointment, lobbying his own civil servants who were advising him not to do that. Why would it surprise us that that self-same Secretary of State then decides sense that it would be a good idea just to make sure that it was a lot harder for those pesky local councillors to get involved in the first place. I think the thing that surprises me, and I can't believe I'm so naive, is that they were so shameless about it this week. So every aspect of local democracy, that is my fear. I'm afraid my answer to you is going to be the most depressing one, I think, which is I am really fearful of what this government is doing to local democracy. I don't know if you saw on Twitter yesterday, there was a list of lumps of money. This was in a document that had gone to Tory MPs, didn't come to us. I can see why. It's blatant bribery in certain areas, and they are clearly targeting seats that we lost to them in December, and also seats that they want to take off us. Given that we need to win 123 seats just to have a majority of one, you can see why they're doing this, because they don't have to try that hard to make it really hard for us. But they're bypassing local democracy. A lot of that money is going straight to LEPs. So, you know, it's either a Metro Mayor who most people even us on this call, most of us would have to think, okay, yeah, I do know who my Metro Mayor is because we're busy trying to replace them at the moment. But in the normal course of daily event, how many people actually know who their Metro Mayor is? Unless it's a good and active Labour one. Ours is a rubbish Tory one. He's absolutely useless. But if you've got a good active Labour one, you know, you've got Sadiq or you've got Joe, you know, maybe you do know who it is. For a lot of people, they don't feel that connection, and it wasn't what they wanted. So I'm really cross because it bypasses local democracy. Now, I've got Councillor Paul Smith in my patch who knows every single blade of grass in his, not just in his ward but across the city, because he's lead for housing. That's who I want involved in making these decisions. So I'm pretty cross about that, and I don't feel particularly hopeful. John, thank you for letting me know about police helping with evictions. I urge anybody who's got actual evidence like that, let your local MP know so that they can then write to the Home Secretary and consider raising it as perhaps an urgent question. I'm not aware of it happening in my patch, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. It just means no one's told me. And especially during a crisis, but at all times, I always say this to community activists, don't assume I'm a mind reader. Unless you tell me stuff, I won't know. If you tell me stuff, then I can act, then I can go to the police. So those of you who are hearing about those things, please make sure that the local MP knows. And also, I will now pass that on to our Shadow Home Secretary and just ask if they've been picking that up in any way across the country, because if that is becoming a widespread pattern, then yeah, well, obviously we need to be challenging that, and I haven't picked that up yet, so thank you. I mean, Paul, you know that I can't make Labour policy up on a Zoom call, but I would consider it to be surprising if we went into the next general election with a policy that makes it easier for the private sector to rip off affordable housing. I would be surprised if we didn't go into the next general election that makes it harder for them and actually makes genuine structures that create truly affordable housing. I'm looking at the moment on a piece of work where we're trying to work through the recommendations of the Affordable Housing Commission, who have defined affordability as no more than 30% of median income. Now, I think that's quite important because that's fiddly to work out, which is why I'm not going to do it right now, but it's not impossible. And I think that comes into what you've said about allowing the private sector to take over affordable housing, is that there are ways of regulating affordable housing so that it's truly affordable. And I actually include in the owner-occupied sector, as well as in the social and the private rented sector. I think it's important that we don't neglect anyone. I think we do need to work across all three. I know this morning's discussion is about the private rented sector, but I think it's, you know, I don't want people unprotected, under-regulated in either of the other two either. I think that's really important. So although I'm not going to make up policy now, I can tell you that does sound like something that we'd be wanting to work on. And there is a policy commission. As you may know, the Housing and Transport Policy Commission closed on Thursday, I think, for taking evidence from members, but we are reading. I'm obviously a member of that commission. Nikki Gavron, you're on it as well. There's quite a few people, I think, on this call who are in that particular one. We are reading all the evidence. Members have put in a lot of evidence. I'm really pleased with that. I think that's great and participatory. We've met twice since April. I've only been a Shadow Secretary of State since April, and you know, I'm really pleased that we are actually cracking on with that democratic accountability. Oh, Shelley's saying the submissions are open till 20th of July. Thank you. And Paul's also adding in something which is music to my ears about private landlords having to join a housing ombudsman scheme. It beggars belief to me that we don't have a system of rules. You know, most professions have rules. You can't just set up and call yourself an accountant. You can't just set up and call yourself a lawyer, but you can just set up and call yourself a landlord. I think at the very least, you either ought to have a qualification or the agent that you employ has to be demonstrably qualified. But again, like I said, I'm not going to put that into policy right now, but I do think that for me, it does beg a belief that we don't have a system that does that. Tom, on Tories getting them to build. Well, I think this speaks to something that I really urge everyone on this call and beyond in the Labour Housing Group and in Labour housing campaigns to do, which is to remember who's on the other side of the House. The Tories are in government. Please lobby Tory MPs, please. I think it's really important because some Tory MPs, especially those in the seats that they accidentally won in December 2019, they are worried because these issues affect them too. Overcrowding affects them too in their patches. We're not talking about Surrey here. We're talking about Burnley. You know, poor quality overcrowded housing exists in a lot of Labour seats, but it also exists in Tory seats, particularly those they won in December. So please lobby them and lobby those local councils. And actually, I think that's something, if you've got evidence, whenever you've got evidence, things like that, tell me as well, give me some concrete examples so that I can then bring that up when we get back to whatever normal is going to be in Parliament. Then I'm going to finish with Liz. Tom and I may disagree here. I don't want to extend the evictions ban. I want the government to fulfil their manifesto commitment to abolishing Section 21 for good, which they said they would. They said they'd make that part of a renters' rights bill. I'd like to see that renters' rights bill now, and I've called on them to publish it now. There's no reason not to. We've had the consultation. They could get on with it. We would cooperate with them cracking through that. We'd also cooperate if they wanted to just do the Section 21 abolition. I've got a bill ready. They don't even need to write the damn thing. We could just abolish Section 21 now. We could also temporarily abolish Section 8, grounds 8, 9 and 10. That would provide the protection that I think our people need. Because on my caseload, as well as people who are struggling with rent, I've also got people who are struggling with absolutely nightmare neighbours. And I know from my conversations with social landlords, and some of you are on this call, that it's really horrible at the moment when you can't evict someone who actually in normal times you would be getting to move on. And I'm thinking I can actually probably walk you to the places in Bristol where I know those nightmares are, and Paul will know them too. And I think that's really problematic, that if we have a total ban, that actually means that we can't deal, social landlords in particular, can't deal with people who are really a problem, or people who are dealing drugs or trafficking women or involving them in county lines operations. So I would like something that is more targeted on our people who are struggling. So no fault evictions, that should obviously go. Section 8 evictions, at least for the life of the crisis, they should go. And I think that would deal with what we're talking about here. Obviously, we've got a broken housing market. If you're going to design a housing system for how to get through the coronavirus crisis, you wouldn't start from here. It wouldn't be this one. This one's rubbish. So what I'm trying to do at the moment is focus on those things where I think we could get Tory budging. And I do think we could get Tory budging on Section 21 and Section 8, given that it is their policy, Section 21 at least. So again, I'm asking those of you, and I think ACORN, you've got a good role in this. If you're operational in areas with Tory seats, particularly in the red wall seats, get pushing them on the Section 21, because that's their actual policy. And the Section 8, we only have to ask them to do it temporarily for the life of the crisis. We can then come in and reform that when we're in government. We've got to make when you want Tories to change their minds in a Tory government, when they don't have to, and they've got an 80 strong majority, you have to focus on the things that we actually could convince them to do. So convincing them to totally reform the housing market, that's not going to happen. That's us, that's what we do. But we could convince them to abolish Section 21 and temporarily lift Section 8, grounds 8, 9 and 10. And I see no reason why we shouldn't be making a real push with Tories for that. We announced that a few months ago. We're pushing on it at the moment. We're going to have a campaign over the summer months. Val Vaz, I got Val Vaz, who's Shadow Leader of the House, to push Jacob Wretched Mogg about that on Thursday and say, you could do this now. They could bring forward the legislation now. We would cooperate. It would be done in one day. We managed to do the building and planning regs legislation on Monday in one day. We could do that with the evictions bans. And then we would be able to lift the evictions ban where social landlords in particular need to be able to evict certain really problematic people. I think that's quite important, that we're targeting on who are our people, who are we defending. So I'm sort of there. I think I've covered everything, John.
Thank you very much, Tom and Thangam. I think that's been a really useful discussion.